the Requiem Metal Podcast, Episode 8, Repulsion.
Welcome to the Requiem Metal Podcast, Episode 8. This is your host, Jason Hundy.
And Mark Rudolph, and joining us again is...
Grind Corcoon.
An appropriately titled name for the territory we're about to go into this evening, I would say.
Ready to thrash it, so...
Or grind it, more appropriately.
Yep.
So if you're joining us from our epic, the last couple of weeks we did a little epic marathon two-parter, and we're going to kind of simplify things a little bit tonight by going back to not only our American roots, but one would say our Michigan roots.
Our hometown boys.
Yeah, our hometown boys from Flint, Michigan. It's the often undercredited Repulsion.
And let's state this fact right up front that we're by no means Repulsion experts. We're doing this for the, kind of like backtracking, figuring out how things work, who inspired who, and it's always been this kind of mysticism around these guys, because a guy that's eventually will be on some of our podcasts, Chris Dick, who's
the elusive Chris Dick,
who's part of the Teeth of Divine site that a lot of you guys have been listening to this, or gals have been listening to this podcast from. But he actually grew up in the Flint area and had seen Repulsion several times at the Capitol Theater, and it was always just kind of like.
Well, he kind of claimed that he didn't really... I don't think he had any context to put a band like Repulsion in.
So you almost think like, oh, these guys just kind of suck, because you're used to hearing like Bay Area sounding metal bands that are kind of spit and polish, but then you hear these guys, they're like, wow, raw, really fast, and
learning to play their drums. I mean, it's almost essentially like the Stooges kind of attempting, speed metal or something on their first record.
These guys were maybe like a couple rungs above on the intensity scale from like crust punk acts, and like I know one of the, I don't know if it was Dave Grave or not, I think it was the first drummer, came from like a Flint punk band called Dissonance.
Oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense.
But they're real similar as far as structure and stuff goes, but they'd throw in, it'd be like a crust song with a Slayer lead and then polka drums, so it was kind of a
and one should say, because we're new to the band in some ways. I mean, we've only recently discovered them in the last like 5 or 6 years when Relapse put out the double disc Horrified.
I've had this Horrified for, I think they came out, I'm not sure when this one came
92, out. 92, I think.
Yeah, 91, 92 is when Relapse, I think, eventually released that.
I got this when I worked for Relapse for a while doing graphic design and picked this up, but it's just more of a historic piece to put to the collection. You didn't really pull it out that often.
Yeah, and then Relapse did this nice Horrified sort of double disc with all their demos and live shows and all the Genocide tracks and some of that stuff, and that was what? Probably 2002, 2001?
2003.
Yeah, 2003, yeah. Right around the time I was kind of leaving college, I remember picking it up. Yeah. And,
really opened my eyes to them. It's the more I've listened to that band, I just realize how underrated they are, how many people they've influenced over the years.
And especially after reading the Choosing Death book.
Yeah.
Seeing how, kind of their place and everything alongside everybody else, it makes a lot more sense, because before it was all kind of hearsay, or read 3 or 4 interviews and see what you can figure out to trace this history back. And
sure,
I mean the album itself was recorded in Horrified. We're talking about that was recorded in 1986,
if I do believe.
Yep, 1986.
Yeah. And the band themselves were really only around for somewhere between like 6 to 8 months. I mean, it was a really sort of short but sweet kind of supernova explosion.
In '84, Scott Carlson and Matt Olivio, the bass player, vocalist, and guitarist, started up a band called Tempter.
Yeah.
In '84, and then eventually became Genocide. And I know Genocide was the band that like Shane Embry was kind of passing around with the guys in Napalm Death, and everybody's like, wow, this is
because they were definitely doing something different.
That
claimed
like,
Siege at the time they were like the fastest band out there.
Sure.
And going back and listening to that compared to stuff now, it's kind of it's hard to remove yourself from like production values and everything now, but hearing that thing in like 1986, hearing that Genocide demo, probably like a 12th generation, that probably sounded pretty crazy.
I mean, yeah, especially at the time, I mean, granted, Rain and Blood was coming out around that time, and Hell Awaits, and some of those records.
But they weren't they weren't on the same. I mean,
sure,
they weren't on the same extremity level as far as just being all out crazy.
You know, you could hear what Araya was singing about and stuff. This was just like pure, you know, like
sound explosion almost.
And then probably if you get a hold of the song titles, I mean, that was a whole nother level beyond what even like the gross out factor that Slayer was promoting with like Necrophiliac and stuff. You know, when you get
this is,
you know, songs like Festering Boils and Splattered
Bodily,
Cadavers, and I mean, they were really pushing a limit. And I guess, you know, kind of as a editorial note, you know, again, if you really want to grasp, you know, the true sort of history of these guys, you know, certainly the liner notes of the double disc Relapse CD or books like Choosing Death or other historical documents are going to do a lot more than what we're going to be able to do. So
this is just our attempt to kind of bring them into the spotlight a little bit and kind of show where we're coming from with them. So,
and one of the things that actually Mark and I kind of realized the other day was we haven't done the American bands yet. Not even just sort of by happy accident. You know, it wasn't anything intentional or you know, anti-American about us, but we just sort of thought
we're kind of going with what we really know well, and you know, we kind of went backwards compared to everybody else. So I mean, Death was one of the few American bands I listened to back in the day, or like, you know, Sepultura is the closest thing that I was listening to from
sure
a little south of the United States. But.
Yeah, and I mean, and you know, speaking of Death, you know, really. Alongside Death, Repulsion and Death were, you know, those early demos, like the Mutilation demos that Death had sort of created, the Mantis kind of stuff from 83 and 84. I mean, that was really the only stuff that was that level of sort of extreme, I think, that was, you know, floating around the underground. I mean, Possessed had done 7 churches in like 1984, 85, but...
Kind of night and day. And then, I mean, the different, like, the other stuff that was coming out at the same time as Repulsion, like a lot of the hardcore punk acts and all that stuff was super, like, you know, political lyrics and all this other stuff. But, you know, Repulsion was just completely, they're just having fun and wanted to be as, like, extreme as possible from everything I've read so far.
Sure. And I think Repulsion even said, like, you know, they would listen to some of that punk stuff. They were into, like, the thrash stuff, of course, and then they were kind of digging on some of the punk stuff, you know, like, I'm sure, like, Crass and some of that. And then they said what really impressed them, one of the bands that we'll play and kind of talk about in relationship to Repulsion is Discharge. And they said what made Discharge stand out was, you know, they had a similar sound that a lot of those sort of punk bands did, but lyrically, they basically said these guys are writing about the apocalypse, you know, through punk music. And
it's pretty heavy stuff.
That really drew them in, you know, was just like how dark, you know, they could be. Because, you know, for... you know, not to discredit what Metallica's lyrics or Slayer's lyrics were in those early years, but they were certainly at a more juvenile level, you know, at that point. And so you kind of take that aspect of Discharge's lyrics and then add it to some of the
guys were dead
the musical stuff,
it,
you know. I mean, I think they said these guys were, you know, they were listening to a lot of Venom, Creator, Celtic Frost, and you know, Discharge.
Master was another one that's always comes up, and that's a band I think I've heard twice.
Yeah,
but everybody talks about it. Anybody that's as far as like, you know, the seminal early extreme metal bands, everybody talks about Master as being this huge influence.
Sure, and I mean for that was, you know, way too early for any of us to, you know.
Well, I think the real big Master records came out before they were on Nuclear Blast for a while, but I think they put kind of a stinker out after the fact. I could be wrong, but I remember being a Master record out that came out at the same time as like Sinister Crossing the Styx, first couple Benedictions, and I was just like
the early Nuclear Blast, like early 90s kind of stuff. Yeah. So, but anyways, back to Repulsion. There's, you know, again, this, you know, Repulsion gets sort of linked in with Death a lot of times because, I mean, some of the members actually technically joined Death for a while.
It was actually when they were still Genocide in '85.
Yeah,
Chuck Schuldiner had him come down. He wanted to have him join up with Death.
And I think he had just fired Rick Ross from the band or something, or he was about to fire Rick Ross. And so he brought these guys down as sort of a replacement. And then this is before they sort of recorded Scream Bloody Gore. So they were in the process of putting some of those songs together. And then I guess from what I've read, they, you know, Cam Lee was in Death at the time, and once they fired Cam Lee,
I think Cam Lee left to form
Massacre.
Yeah,
and then those guys were just like, well, nothing's going on here now. The drummer left. Well, let's just go back to Michigan.
Taco joints. They just wanted to thrash out and have fun.
Yeah, and so
what they're saying.
They were sort of briefly in Death, but never really showed up on any like actual official recordings except for a few demos, and then went back up to Flint and said, let's concentrate on Genocide, you know. not the literal act of genocide, but actually, I think I was reading an interview where I think Scott Carlson was sort of apologizing for the name Genocide. He's like, that's the only a band name we could come up with when we were 16. He goes, it's such a stupid name now. He goes, because it's nothing we stand for, and Repulsion is more of a, once they kind of switch over, that represents kind of more, I don't know, more of an abstract concept of.
It goes into all the ridiculousness of all their song titles, Stench of Burning Death, and
sure,
totally over the top,
which inspired a tremendous amount of bands, anyone from Autopsy to Carcass and Dismember, and I mean, and we're going to get into the ties into the whole Swedish death scene.
Another Chris Dickism that we'll bring up is the town that he was from in just outside of Flint, Swartz Creek. White Earp Records was there, and White Earp Records was actually I think it was Doug Wyatt. He just passed away a couple years ago. He's the one that actually financed the first record to put out, but something ended up getting hung up where they couldn't put that out. So it kind of sat on the shelves. It's kind of like one of those things like that Dismember and Entombed, that Entombed just beat Dismember to the punch. So that
because Dismember
seminal.
Because Dismember couldn't get anybody to release like an ever flowing stream.
So I think a little while after the fact, Jeff Walker and Bill Steer, they had a label back in the day.
Necrosis or something?
Something like that. And they ended up putting it out, but it was kind of like too little too late. Everybody was like, well,
it wasn't marketed from what they heard. And then I think finally the rights disappeared in 91. Earache and Necrosis lost the rights, and then Relapse gobbled up the rights, and then they sort of put this, Horrified out proper.
But hearing this when it came out in that era, it just seemed out of place. Sure. Like you didn't have any context for it. So that's one of the reasons why I never really glommed onto it too much.
In all honesty, I mean, could you say for you, your perspective, being 92, 93 was right when you were just getting into this sort of stuff? Now, maybe you bought it like in 96, maybe, a couple of years after.
It was in 96, I guess.
Okay. And at that point, there wasn't this, I don't think there was this ability to look backwards at death metal.
No, the scene was too young. You didn't know if it was going to be around 2 more years and then die out or not, But
by 2003, all of a sudden, you can look back and you can see a much greater sort of breadth of history, and you can kind of...
Well, and there's books being written about this stuff now. It's been taken seriously, documentaries and the like, so...
Yeah, that's made a big difference as far as kind of putting perspective on things. Having some kind of history instead of having it be hearsay through... through fanzines, basically.
Yeah,
like
it brings a little bit of
years ago.
Sure.
It brings like some legitimacy to the art form. So,
and it makes me think of like a band that like I think all three of us have recently sort of discovered, which is ridiculous. Is Suffocation.
Yeah.
As a band, I think I always read through hearsay that they were just sort of a deicide knockoff, or just another
Well, they got lumped into the TION bands.
Yeah.
Immolation, Incantation,
exactly,
Suffocation.
which I never really steered towards, and so I just sort of lumped them in with that. And again, but now like you can get some history about them and realize their place, and then you can kind of go back and reappreciate.
Yeah,
them.
unfortunately, a lot of those. At least the not really getting into those bands came from, at least for me, from like people around me that were listening to that stuff that I didn't really care for them.
Yeah, the sort
it's
of
like, oh god, they listen to this crap. Well, we're not on the same page, so I'm not going to like this.
Yeah, kind of the meathead mosh pit, like want to fight, violent.
Which I can see those kind of vibes from Suffocation. Like I can see why the fans would be into the music, but that stuff's unbelievable. That's got to be
swirling.
Yeah, I want to do a little bit more research before we do a Suffocation episode, but I definitely want to try to.
Sure,
because they're up there with Morbid Angel in my mind.
Yeah. But not to get into Suffocation territory, but again, Repulsion really, from that bass sound was really almost the defining principle of Repulsion, as well as like Dave Grave, his sort of
kind of the cheating blast,
the pseudo blast.
Yeah,
they were saying. I don't know if it was in Choosing Death or some stuff I was reading online, but. He was playing it wrong, but he was playing it faster than everybody else that could do a blast beat. So that kind of became his thing. And I think most of the songs on Horrified, when they recorded them, or when they wrote the songs originally, were supposed to be like a lot slower tempo. But once he got in there, he couldn't slow down.
Yeah.
And it ended up kind of, that's why every song's at almost like a wave to the whole thing, kind of pushing it to the end.
Yeah, they were mainly, kind of supposed to be a Slayer type tempo, and then it's almost like a car just careening off the road at that point.
Yeah,
and that's why all the songs clock in a little over a minute.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Slayer was almost sort of their meter stick by which they started all their songs. It was like their starting line point, but like where they crossed the finish line was something where completely, way out, like you said, off the tracks. Train has left the tracks.
Yep.
I mean, would you say that Mick from Napalm was hearing some of this stuff when he was trying to perfect some of his drumming style, or do you think that because of the Shane Embury was grabbing some of these Genocide demos and passing them around? I mean,
I'm sure that had a lot to do with. I mean, some of the, I know Mick. That was pretty when he was doing stuff.
It was almost the exact same time.
It was really close, and I know he was more into like heavy metal. Wasn't Mick Harris more into the heavy metal stuff than the other guys were more into the punk side of things?
Yeah,
I think of the original members. Yeah,
Broderick and Bullen.
Nick Bullen,
Nick Bullen definitely didn't want anything to do with metal at all, which it's pretty evident by some of the interviews you hear. But anyways, again,
but their styles are kind of similar. Like I think Mick Harris was a little bit more refined version of Dave Grave.
Sure, and whereas these guys sort of took Repulsion took, I guess, Discharge and punk and mixed it with like Slayer. Napalm was taking Celtic Frost and mixing it with punk, and Siege and that sort of stuff. And so they each kind of had their meter stick metal band, and then they just would put these hardcore punk elements into it and just try and play faster than anybody else had ever even kind of achieved of. But I think the difference between I think Napalm and Repulsion probably should be kind of lined up at times. But I think one of the big differences that I would notice about the two is that Napalm seemed like a conscious act in some way. Like there was a political consciousness about what they were trying to do.
Yeah.
Whereas Repulsion just seemed like, four guys in a garage who just accidentally created,
just wanted to make it as extreme as possible, basically.
And just have fun. I mean, they mention that time and time again. We're just trying to have fun.
Sure. And that's definitely evidenced by, I mean, if you look at some of the band photos of these guys, they're definitely, 80s metalers. We kind of have a laugh at the Dave Graves mustache. If you're listening,
the cookie
Dave
duster,
Grave, that's pretty funny. And I guess he got his name Dave Grave because when they were trying to find a drummer, they
he just got arrested for grave
robbing or something.
This would be great for our image.
And that's what people were going for. I mean, when you ask Chuck Schuldiner why did he come up with the name Death, he's like, it said everything I wanted to about a band. He goes, I was 14 years old. I mean, what's scarier than death? So. Anyways, let's get to some music. Let's hear what these guys kind of sound like. So we're gonna play now. Have these ones that Relapse just put out? Have they been mastered? Are they remastered? I mean,
I think slightly. I mean, you're dealing with 2 tracks, either 2 or 4 track recordings. So, I mean, they're pretty rough.
Yeah,
we'll put it that way. But I mean, compared to Scum or From Enslavement, similar sound quality.
Sure. Yeah. And I think this has a warmth to it that's just, it kind of...
It sounds like everything's being maxed out. Like the bass, when
as soon as on the mics
when he hits a note on the bass, the whole thing just fuzzes out, and that becomes the wall of sound that everything else kind of surrounds.
And that's essentially what laid the ground roots to sort of the Stockholm scene, almost in a way, was that sort of fuzzy warmth.
They found a way to capture it.
Yeah, exactly.
But the bass sound on Repulsion's like more extreme than the original Napalm bass sound, I think.
Sure, I would agree. Yeah. I would agree, for sure.
But I can see where, like, later on, where Shane is trying to take his... I still don't understand how he could play, like, 15 notes and have it completely fuzzed out. Like, what's the point? But, we'll save that for another show.
There you go. But we're going to open... Probably my personal favorite is the opening track, Stench of Burning Death, which we're going to hear. And then we're going to hear... Radiation Sickness, and what else? Festering Boils. Right?
Good one, yeah.
Yeah, so, fun for the whole family, I think, is, so get your family and gather around.
And we'll see you back in about 3 minutes.
Yeah.
It's about a
just heard a trio of Repulsion songs. Any comments about any of those three particular songs in terms of their...
Well, the first, the reason we kind of picked how we did, we skipped out on Eaten Alive, Acid Bath, Slaughter the Innocent, Decomposed. Those, basically, Stench of Burning Death kind of writes the blueprint for the next half a dozen songs. Yeah. So just to kind of get to the point, and if people, this is kind of a historical episode to some degree, so this isn't something you're going to probably run out and grab the CD, but just to give you a taste of it.
It's a historical document is really what we're trying to establish here.
And later on in the show, we're going to show a little bit of comparison between, some other bands that have obviously, grabbed a lot of inspiration from this record.
Sure.
And then after Stench of Burning Death, we heard Radiation Sickness and Festering Boils. It's a good one for the kids.
And it should be said that you mentioned Slaughter the Innocent. And Slaughter the Innocent was the original title of Horrified, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. I think it's changed to Horrified because of legalities or something.
Something like that. Or nobody wanted a record called Slaughter the Innocent. Horrified was more PC. I mean, I don't know. It's really hard to say with things back then. But
I had a couple notes on...
oh, go ahead.
On Festering Boils. It was like the first, at least to my ears, it was the first, like, the most dynamic song that wasn't just and then typical vocal pattern over and over and over again until the minute was up. It'd actually have some breakdowns, and there's actually some, if you listen really carefully, this is a 128 kilobit MP3 you're listening to, so keep that in mind. But you can hear the faint beginnings of that Swedish single string sound that went on to inform the
Gothenburg scene, really, kind of the early At the Gates kind of, single string picking.
And then Radiation Sickness just had more of a crust.
Sure.
It had the crust breakdowns that once you've heard them, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Sure. And speaking of crust, the next direction we were going to go is, we were just, for kind of comparison's sake, we were going to play a Discharge song, because again, I think most of you who are probably listening are probably familiar with Slayer and Venom, or at least maybe you've probably heard that sort of stuff, whereas Discharge may be sort of a band kind of off your radar.
They've kind of always been cult, and their stuff's been really hard to find, except for a couple, was it 2-3 years ago this came out?
It's longer than that. It's probably like six or seven. 2004.
They came out with pretty much their entire catalog on one little box set.
Yeah, it was a 3-disc Society's Victims. It was pretty cool.
And going back and listening to a lot of that stuff, you can really see how a lot of grind, a lot of death metal definitely been influenced by what they're doing.
Yeah,
sure.
They just heard this stuff and like, well, what can we do to punch it up to the next level? Well, let's scream.
Yeah, and I remember
like Cookie Monster.
I remember a few years back, Terrorizer doing like the top 100, top 50 greatest punk records of all time, and this was number one. Because of its influence, I think, on metal.
Its influence on every contemporary punk band out there too.
Yeah,
I mean, like Rancid, all those guys.
Sure, absolutely. In terms of look and style, and
exactly.
Just, I mean, Rancid's probably not as apocalyptic as these guys.
Oh, no, but as far as like more extreme punk than what Sex Pistols. And,
exactly.
A couple of other people were doing in the 70s. But.
And their big record, the one that most people sort of say is the essential record to get, is Hear Nothing, See Nothing, See Nothing, Say Nothing. Yeah, so hear no evil, see no evil, say no evil.
And there's the band Discharge that came out with, what was it, Seeing, Feeling, Bleeding?
Yeah, exactly.
Which is basically just a worship record.
And really to Discharge, if we're talking in terms of metal influence too, there's this whole genre of dis bands that sort of came up. Disrupt, Dysphere, Dischange, who you already mentioned.
That's another episode. The
dis bands. There you go. We just wrote ourselves a contract, and so we're gonna play a cut off that to start this next talk set. It's called "I Won't Subscribe," and then we're gonna go into a couple songs from the Genocide days, which we'll talk about when we come back. So enjoy.
System has a time around my throat.
So we just listened to Eaten Alive and Crypt of Terror from, 1986 Genocide demos, and surprisingly enough, it actually sounds a little cleaner.
Yeah. It had almost more of a groove going or something. It
had a lot more like German thrash I could feel in that as well.
Sounded like they kind of put it together a little bit at that point.
Yeah. And they were definitely influenced by Creator, I think I remember reading somewhere, so maybe they just, Pleasure to Kill was really like inspiring them at the moment or something. But
yeah, during our, while you're listening to the selections we were playing for, Jason brought up the cover of Horrified, which, if you're lucky enough to have the original, the 1992 Relapse version of it, I don't know if the original cover it was exactly this or not, but
I sure hope so.
It's a it's a close up of a skull, but the coloring and the rendering looks almost like kind of if a high school student was told, or a junior high student was told in art class to draw the scariest zombie skull you possibly could.
I was gonna say,
and then color it with purples and blues and yellows.
Yeah, really bad color. Like I said, it almost reminded me of some kind of bad, like you said, like a 12-year-old trying to like trace a EC Tales from the Crypt comic or something.
Yeah.
Like,
but you go back and look at most of look at the Nihilist demos, look at Dismember Carnage demos. They all had these really crude drawings. But
it was like a badge of honor to make these as awful as humanly possible.
So the Relapse reissue from 2003 actually has the full zombie head in all of its glory, but it's recolored and it doesn't quite have the.
I like
the same.
I like the purple close up. Really, you know,
it has like a 50 sensibility.
Exactly. You can really, you know, the eye missing really kind of comes out of it too.
Yeah, plus dripping over the eye. There.
The newer version kind of looks like they had the head sitting in a box for about like 5 years, and then kind of browned
that kind of makes
out,
sense.
Yeah, that's true. It went from purple to brown. So
it's like one of those little apple heads you'd make as a kid and stick in the window.
Yeah. I think next year, guys, in honor of this, we should carve a pumpkin that looks like this. I think we should, make
Repulsion
a whole
Halloween special.
Repulsion Halloween special.
Might take a while.
Yeah, we might have to leave the pumpkin out from now till next October, so it rots a little
purple
bit.
Paint.
So, but we're gonna turn back. We just wanted to give you a little taste of what Repulsion sounded like before they recorded some of the Horrified stuff, and so that's where we went with a couple of Genocide tracks, and now we'll jump back into a little bit of the Horrified stuff, and we're gonna hear 6 Feet Under, which I may have just possibly inspired a band name. I would say
that's pretty common subject matter for this era of stuff.
but I'm guessing that there's some
it could have even
owed there.
Informed the television show on HBO.
I bet HBO executives
probably are pretty big
Repulsion fans. I mean, most people are, I think, who get into some of this stuff. But
this track in particular, 6 Feet Under, kind of at least when I was listening to it last night, I could pick up some of the later on Napalm like transitions. They do a lot of the sliding around stuff. You can hear it real faintly. The production's pretty rough on this, but if you can really really listen hard, you can hear some of those. Was it Mick Harris, right? The guitar player.
Yeah, Mick. Yeah, I'm
the
confused
Mick Harris stuff from like Diatribe's era. You can hear a little bit of that in it, real under the surface, and who knows if that actually informed anything. But
well, you're talking the drumming or the guitar playing? Because you're talking
the guitar playing.
Mitch. Then
Mitch.
You're talking Mitch.
Yeah.
And is this the tune that sounds like? It
has almost
a
a Slayer intro.
sort of intro.
That
we identify as like necrophiliac,
like
Antichrist, Hellwaiter. Yeah, exactly. So, and then we're gonna hear Bodily Dismemberment, and that's got some interesting things kind of going on with the blast beat, right? That's really the first appearance.
Yeah, because the whole record's pretty consistent as far as the speed of the drumming, but there's like a true, if you want to. The dictionary definition of what a blast beat is, that's it right there. Mm-hmm. Where you're doing the alternating snare and ride cymbal back and forth, like just kind of thing. What's the guy's name that originally
Charlie Benante and SOD
Anthrax who claims it, I guess.
Well, Charlie don't cheat, as he said once. So I mean, you got to give props where props are due. So all right, enjoy 6 Feet Under and Bodily Dismemberment. hopefully you enjoyed Bodily Dismemberment as much as I did, and 6 Feet Under. So we're going to kind of continue probably our the last little set of sort of Horrified songs, because I think at this point you're going to, get a real historical sense, I think, of what it sounds like. And if you're really digging on this sort of stuff, obviously pick up some Autopsy, some other bands that we're going to talk about, a little bit later on the show. But in particular, I think this trio of songs that we're going to sort of end the Repulsion stuff with, it's probably the most refined, most interesting,
and
dynamic,
it's the most diverse
kind of stuff
from everything. Like, what the hell was the first song?
Black Breath.
Jeez, Bee Breath. You got to write all this stuff out. It's getting late. No, but
the witching hour, it's crept upon us.
But Black Breath is actually the first song that actually slows down and is catchy. It's more like
grooves in it.
Yeah, like a thrash kind of speed.
And of course, Black Breath may sound familiar to some of you, diehard Swedish metal fans, because of course, Entombed will later cover it, which we'll talk about in a bit. But yeah, Black Breath to me is the standout track. I mean, as much as
it's the one I always went back and listened to purely for the fact that I heard Entombed do a cover of it, so I wanted to hear the original.
Sure, absolutely. And then we're gonna hear probably my favorite song title on the record is "Maggots in Your Coffin." Because if death wasn't bad enough, you've got to worry about maggots.
That's probably what happened to the guy on the cover.
That's true. That's true. It was this, it kind of ruined.
I thought there was a story about maggots in your coffin. But,
is there? All right, I'll let you look for it a little bit, and then we're going to close with the title track, "Horrified," which again, speaking from sort of kind of dynamic circles, it's the album closer, probably for a reason, because it's I think if Repulsion were to have continued, this is probably the direction they would have gone in. It's probably built off the dynamics of these three songs.
Well, how great is it that they've got, the album title is called Horrified, and they have a song title called Horrified, and they have a song title called Repulsion.
Yes. I mean, that's you can't beat that, really.
True sign of greatness, really.
I always love it when a band can come and do a song, the self-titled song.
And they hopefully maybe played with wearing T-shirts of themselves, which was like a weird product of the 80s. But actually, you know what? On the back cover, I'm gonna give these guys props, because they're not wearing
he has a
T-shirts.
Wile E. Coyote T-shirt. Scott Carlson does.
Which I think had sort of street cred. If you're talking the hipster crowd, to sort of be metal, but not truly metal. I kind of appreciate that.
Yeah, that's a couple steps up above the Tasmanian Devil T-shirts.
That is true.
Rocked out in the early 90s.
That is true. Yeah.
Well, Wile E. Coyote is pretty extreme, trying to drop anvils on everyone. So
exactly. Acid bath. That's probably something that he tried to attempt on the.
I'm pretty sure that's
probably
where the band got the name from too.
Yeah, exactly. So, anyways, we'll stop wasting your time with our mindless rambling. But so enjoy a trio of Repulsion songs.
To die.
And we're back, and you just heard your final set of Repulsion songs for the evening. But we have more on the way, don't we?
We do. What do we got next, guys?
Oh, I'm going to talk about a few of the bands that influenced or were influenced by Repulsion.
Absolutely, and I think it should go without mentioning. We didn't want to spend too much time talking about these guys because these guys really deserve their own show.
Sure.
Autopsy was sort of coming up around the same time, a little bit after Repulsion,
and they kind of took it to another level.
Exactly. Musically, they were way more proficient. I mean, obviously, I not to knock on Repulsion, but they only had 6 months to formulate really the sound that they were going to do, and had they had more time and been able to release more albums and record something proper, it would have... I
think half the problem came down to who could record this stuff and know how to capture it.
Exactly.
That's the problem.
Exactly, and I think by the time that, Autopsy records their first couple records, Severed Survival. Yeah, and then Mental Funeral.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a scene emerging around this, and people were starting to understand the dynamics of it.
I believe they were from the Bay Area, too, so there's, you had all the Bay Area thrash stuff around there.
Probably more of an infrastructure to get people to play with. And, versus Flint, Michigan, which, it's a good town, but not exactly.
They had an alright punk scene in the town at the time, but as far as metal bands, I can't really think of a whole lot.
It's kind of interesting, though, when you think about Flint, because of where Napalm was sort of coming out of and where Black Sabbath had come out of as well. Birmingham, which was sort of
industrial towns,
a dying industrial, grimy, dirty city. And I mean, if those of you have never been to Flint,
well, Flint just had a little bit of a resurgence downtown, but I mean that all the car companies are pulling all the factories out. So I mean, there's nothing in Flint.
Sure, and if you want a good sort of, albeit a little bit biased, but at least a documentary feel of what Flint sort of looked like around this era.
Roger
and Me from Michael Moore, will show you just how decrepit and bad things were getting, and kind of the perfect place for a band like a Repulsion or Napalm.
I remember going over to the Capitol Theater and seeing like Unleashed and Demented Ted and some other interesting bands from the time. But Unleashed played over there like 3 or 4 times at the Capitol Theater. That was like the only place north of Detroit in Michigan where you could watch a metal show.
Yeah. And, speaking of Unleashed, one of the bands that we would say were heavily influenced by the Repulsion sound was an early sort of Swedish death metal band by the name of Nihilist. And we've mentioned Nihilist before, I think, when we did the Dismember show. Mm-hmm. And Nihilist put out a series of demos in 88 and 89 before the band kind of basically broke up and went in many divergent ways.
And formed Entombed and Unleashed and Carnage.
Yeah, exactly. And so, it's sort of worth mentioning that whereas the American scene may not have really picked up on what Repulsion was doing, because, Repulsion did all this stuff and so did Death around the same time. Mm-hmm. But I think people in the States really, picked up more with the Death sound. Or the Napalm sound.
Yeah.
And then sort of took that into different directions, like Obituary.
It's the whole thing about, a foreigner appreciating something, like, how people in Europe treat jazz musicians from the United States, like, art ensembles, treated like they're celebrities when they go to France or something. Sure. So I think that might have been some part of it, too, is that, in some sleepy town in Sweden, somebody's hearing Repulsion from Flint, Michigan, like, wow, that's, it just kind of probably had an exotic quality to it, I'm sure.
Yeah. Sure, absolutely.
Definitely.
And
Nicky Anderson's gone on the record 1,000,000 times saying how, Repulsion was like a huge influence on him.
And we're going to hear a song from Nihilist's Premature Autopsy demo, which was from 1988. We're going to hear Sentenced to Death, and then we're going to hear the aforementioned Black Breath cover by Entombed, which was on the Out of Hand EP.
Yeah, it also had a Kiss cover of God of Thunder.
Oh, perfect. Which is a pretty cool cover, if I remember right.
Yeah.
And there it is, Black Breath. And this came out, 85, 86? Probably 84, 85.
This is 93, dude.
Oh, that's what I meant.
Okay.
Wrong decade. I was thinking the 90s and wrong number there. So, right around the time that, Entombed had signed the Columbia Earache kind of deal, and they were doing the crossover with Wolverine comics and all that sort of stuff. And Out of Hand was sort of banned off of some of the American versions.
I don't know why. Was it because of lyrical content?
Yeah, some swearing.
It was lyrical.
Oh yeah, there's
sort of religious
some F-bombs in it or something.
Yeah, definitely some swearing. And so they had to put it out as a separate EP, and this is a perfect place to throw, a nice little cover on there. And so, you're going to hear Entombed's sort of ode to Repulsion, which you'll of course hear definitely the similarities in sound. And then we're going to close out the talk set with, again, part of this sort of Nihilist Entombed connection, which is the more recent band Death's Breath, which is Nikki Anderson, who was in Nihilist and was in Entombed, who quit Entombed, started a sort of a more of a traditional like Stooges MC5 kind of punk band, and then kind of said, well, hey, I want to write Repulsion songs. And so he's put out this Death's Breath record. Is there anyone else on the Death's Breath record?
Not that I can remember off the top of my head.
Okay, yeah, it doesn't ring a bell as well, but this, if you get a chance, those of you in the internet universe, which I would imagine would be a lot of you,
if you're listening to
podcasts, should YouTube this song Death's Breath, because
it's got some pretty good insider stuff. See if you can catch up on from Entombed's past.
Yeah, there's some funny. It's basically a kind of a zombie video.
Yeah, it's kind of Night of the Living Dead, humor. But with way more of a sense of humor.
Exactly. So, any final thoughts before we hit this place?
I'll have a couple after we come back from the talk set.
All right.
Or after we come back from the listening.
Well, enjoy Sentenced to Death from Nihilist, 1988. And we're back. Hopefully you enjoyed the Repulsion sound as channeled through other bands there.
That was a very, just kind of a little sneak peek of it. There's a lot out there.
Sure.
This is just kind of stuff we had around and thought of, so...
And I mean, you could go and listen to Carnage, which is another great band, kind of that was formed out of Nihilist, which became essentially Dismember.
Even early Unleashed has a little bit of the sound. Early Therion does.
Mm-hmm. Basically anything out of that Stockholm scene, you know, and even to some extent some of the stuff that was happening with Grotesque, you know, which became kind of at the gates in a way. But
I think most established bands, if you ask about influences, usually most of the time Repulsion pops up. If they were a band that started in the late '80s, early '90s, that's totally one of the number ones. So
I doubt a lot of bands from the late '90s.
I wouldn't think so. Just
they were probably influenced by Entombed. So,
kind of a hand in hand type thing, but not.
Exactly.
Not a direct comparison. Really.
And so we figured, that a lot of you out there sort of listening who may, be fans of Entombed or Dismember or some of this other stuff or may not have ever been able to make the Repulsion connection because maybe you haven't read the books or any of these, that kind of ode to these guys. I mean, maybe you've even heard Black Breath, but it never occurred to you that it was a cover, whose cover it was. And so... again, I think that's a good enough reason to sort of place this historical kind of document on these guys.
Listeners out there, we'd all like to hear what you thought about our historical episode like this. If this is something you're interested in, if you liked it, if it was boring, if you had to turn it off halfway through because of Repulsion, but send us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com. That's REQUIEM podcast@gmail.com.
So, well, until next time.
I'm Mark Rudolph.
And I'm Jason Hundy, and thank you again, Jeff, for sitting in on us.
Not a problem. Always happy to be here.
Grind on.